I'm here in Moldova with Garry Robson. It's a bit of a strange combination because Garry Robson is a fellow Brit who lives in Poland, and Moldova is a fair distance from Poland. But we're here for the Chișinău Forum 2023, hosted by Iurie Roșca, a former Deputy Prime Minister of Moldova. Garry, what have we got ourselves into?
Very good question. We've got ourselves into something like a very interesting kind of film, or interesting kind of unfamiliar reality. The most hospitable, friendly people I can remember meeting for a very long time in a beautiful village environment. What are we, like 25 kilometers from Chișinău, in a kind of domestic setting, preparing for the conference, with a very hospitable host and specific and quite inspiring environment, I would say.
We've left the window open deliberately so that you can hear the women folk of what Iurie describes as his clan getting the food and other preparations in order. He's been doing this for years, Mr. Roșca. He's a well-known politician in his own country and in the Russian-speaking world, and of course in Romania because they share a language with Moldova. I think what we could say is he's nobody's man. He's decided to tell the Romanians and the Russians to keep their distance from his nation's internal affairs, which hasn't won him many friends. Formerly quite close to the Putin crowd, particularly Alexander Dugin, much less so now. And he has become a figure closely aligned in thinking with Patrick Wood, Ian Davis. What other names could you come up with in that bracket? Skeptical about technocracy and about multipolarization.
Yeah, the two together in this interesting perspective he has, yeah.
And this year, we frankly don't know the other speakers personally. That makes it all the more interesting. There's a mixture of, I'm looking at the name badges on the table in the study here, Romanian and Moldovan names, and some French speakers, and a couple of Russian speakers. A German whom we met this
to be a professor. I've been there for 15 years. I'm British originally, from London. Well, I'm British still from London. I'm a professor of sociology there, and for the last 10 to 15 years or so, I've been concentrating on two things in my teaching, which is mostly at master's and PhD level, and those are technocracy. So it began with an interest in surveillance, but over the years, as we understood more about surveillance, it began to get more of a conception of how systematic and widespread the kind of plans for what surveillance has led us into.
Was there ever a time when you could not say technocracy in an academic environment, when you were accused of conspiracy theory for using the word?
Yes, this is why I myself am organising a conference 2 weeks, or is it later this month, which Alex will also be attending, which is called The Rise of the Digital Technocracy, which, as far as I know, is, somebody can write and prove me wrong, but as far as I know, it's the first formal university-based conference in which the word technocracy appears. I may be wrong, but I myself haven't seen it. So
I got that strong impression that you were breaking a path in the ice, really, by talking about this at a serious academic level.
Yes, partly in order to try and attract the attention and galvanize more academics, who in the last 3 years seem to me have, on the whole, have been much too quiet for various reasons that we don't have time to go into. But yes, I think I'm trying to galvanize the small proportion of university-based academics that may be open to it, which I'm afraid is rather small, again, for a lot of reasons, but we will see. But I'm trying to get it. Yeah, I think it's a rare event.
Have you noticed any geographical or any subject area splits in how willing academic colleagues are to discuss technocracy, give papers, and be associated with your aims?
I have found in the social sciences, which is where surprisingly few in the social sciences and political science. And I think one of the reasons for this, and there are others, but one of the reasons may be that we are very entrenched now in in our specialisms, and people tend to be very. But partly this is enforced by the system. You know, the kind of neoliberal reorganization of higher education as a business means that people are now develop a specialism, have to publish in the specialism, have to research in the specialism, and tend only to really know very much about one thing.
Mm.
And so, in my with some of my political science colleagues, not necessarily at the Jagiellonian, but people I can think of in North America and Britain, of thinking the kind of conventionalized terms that those disciplines kind of teach them, and find it very difficult to kind of break the horizon to look at, for example, as we'll be looking at, kind of power centers that come, serious power and effective power centers that come from beyond the national political, nation state political, old conventional geopolitical thinking. So that kind of thing is in play, I think.
Is the theory of power one of your main research areas?
No, not really. Well, I've been a sociologist for quite a long time. My main research is, my main areas of interest have tended to be on the qualitative side of things. I'm very interested in ethnography, micro sociology.
In the social sciences, I understand a massive distinction between qualitative and quantitative research.
Yes, I think it's become a kind of caricature now. But some years ago, I became very disillusioned with when in the postmodern, post-structuralist thing, in which everything became so-called theory. And we were having to deal with so-called theories, which were really just lists of assertions that in no way usefully described the reality humans live in, very often, and in very kind of remote and abstract ways of talking about society and humans. So one of the things I started to do with my students was trying to counter that by going in for things like so-called grounded theory, in which you can only say things, make kind of sociological interpretations of what's happening if you look very closely at human beings and what they do, what they care about, what things mean to them, and what they do. So this, for me, is a much more interesting way of approaching sociology, and that's not entirely congruent, perhaps, with my more recent interest in the technocracy, but what the bridge was watching how many young people, both known to me personally and my students, were being bewildered, confused, distracted, and made uneasy. And as I later came to discover, highly manipulated by their smartphones. And their suffering, to me, seemed to require a close attention to the detail of their experience. So I've tried to put together a kind of concern for what happens to people and what people do and what things mean to people, with a slightly more abstract or theoretical idea about how technocracy can work. And that's the kind of thing I'll be talking about tomorrow.
It's very refreshing to hear a social studies man talking about experience rather than power. I think that's far more akin to the term didn't exist before a century ago, but we know that this branch of learning is much older than that. It's been much more akin to that in the past, hasn't it? What people's experience of life is, rather than where this nebulous thing called power is supposed to reside.
Yes, and since humanity is now under such pressure across a range of fronts, at the everyday level of emotion, attempts to comprehend what's going on, anxiety about the future, I think that it makes no sense to me to try and provide an account of the so-called Great Reset and the powers behind it and its intentions, unless we also connect that to, well, in this case, the harm it's doing to just the people we know. So I like to think in terms of a human-friendly or human-focused way of working, which also deals with fairly high-level concepts, but I don't see why the two things can't be brought together or shouldn't be brought together more.
Finally, what about your own talk tomorrow? Would you like to give us a sneak preview?
Sneak preview is I will be attempting to connect so-called woke, which I think is a much more serious thing than the term implies, and will not be going away anytime in the near future, because amongst other things, it seems to be like a theological justification for the form of governments and society somebody is trying to move us into. And what I call the cybernetic conditioning of children, which is the step beyond propaganda.
Cybernetics, of course, is feedback loop.
Feedback loops, in this case, the closed feedback loops in which closed and controllable. So the image I would use is a child, a young child or teenager with the phone in their face all the time. This to me represents a kind of cybernetic loop.
Would you go so far as to say it's Skinnerian conditioning?
Yes, absolutely Skinnerian conditioning, but taken to a much more sophisticated level by a thing called social physics. There's a guy called Alex Pentland at MIT who claims to be able to engineer in the direction of swarm or hive-like movements of people on the basis of endless metadata through nudging them.
So there's a science of the hive mind.
Yes, and it's very dangerous, and because he claims, and he's very influential in his sector, and he claims that he is going in the future to be able to move populations ideologically and emotionally in preferred directions through a process of what's called nudge, a form of nudging which people are not aware of, kind of subliminal nudging through the phone. And the connection between these two things is you have this Great Reset ideology, which, if we think about Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, that moment where the slaves begin to enjoy and love and embrace their own servitude, I think there are processes in motion which are trying to create a generation of young people who in 10, 15, 20 years' time will accept what the cabal, whatever we call the so-called elite, plan for us without much fuss, and that would be a purely technocratic kind of managerial handling of the population.
The US Army is having to get to grips with millennials earlier than most employers, because you take teenagers to the Army rather than people in their 20s for most other jobs now. And they are already saying this is a generation that is almost clinically phobic of being in the presence of other people.
Yes.
And you have to put them in a little operating cubicle or the virtual equivalent to do their jobs. So that's the further perfection of that, should we say. Now, the first wave, at least in modern history, of captains of industry, corporatists wanting to remake man in their own image to their own ends of being good little unthinking producers, probably was the late 19th century, the Prussian model. And there, the carrot and the stick were, well, the carrot was you could get a nice job and a guaranteed job for life and some social status, and the stick was the school bell and also corporal punishment, wasn't it? One of the German writers at the time said that each German has his backbone broken twice, by the army and by the school. Now you're arguing that all that is happening inside our heads in the new model.
Yes, I think our head is the battleground now. This looks to me like I think I might have said this in the previous thing. It's fifth generation unrestricted warfare, mostly based on psychological manipulation and misinformation. So I think that this would be, if it becomes successful, and I don't know if this happens to all children, but I think if kids who don't have adults around them who understand something about what these smartphones really are, which I believe are entrainment devices, are really at risk of being sucked unawares into an acceptance of a worldview and a set of principles, values, and ideas that will make it much easier for the purveyors of the great set to have success in the long run.
All the footage of the Chișinău conference, Chișinău Forum, will go up online. I don't have all the websites to hand, but one safe place that I can expect much of the footage, if not all of it, to go on is Yuri Roshka's Rumble channel, and that's rumble.com/userierosca, or just search for Chișinău Forum. Not an easy name to spell, but it's the capital of Moldova. You can look it up. So join us in due course for that, where we'll both be giving a talk. And also, Garry, looking forward to meeting you again in Krakow later in the month.
It's a good month. It's a good month for those of us who are really trying to do something about all of this in an interesting way. Very smooth presenting.
Oh, thank you.